We're in Ezra chapter 2. If you turn there in your Bibles, Ezra chapter 2. And this is an interesting passage. It's primarily a genealogy of the families who made the return back to Jerusalem. And so I will begin in verse 1. Let me get my notes out. And we're going to get through this entire chapter today, one way or another. So it says there in verse 1, "Now these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity, of those which had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away unto Babylon, and came again unto Jerusalem and Judah, every one unto his city, which came with Zerubbabel." He was the governor or leader of this expedition. "Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Realiah, Mordecai, Belshan, Midspar, Bigvai, Rehum, Baanah, the number of the men of the people of Israel." And then it goes beginning in verse number 3, and it lists all of these people by name with the head of households. I will probably pass over reading all of these names in deference to the people whose names I will undoubtedly butcher. And some of this is somewhat repetitious, as you probably have ascertained by looking over the rest of the chapter. Many pastors or teachers, Bible teachers, when they're teaching a series on the book of Ezra, will sometimes skip over most of the details completely from Ezra chapter 2 because it's just pretty much a genealogy of the families that came back, and they think to themselves, what practical lessons can we draw from this? But we know that all Scripture is what? Given by inspiration of God and is profitable for us. In fact, God saw fit not only here in Ezra chapter 2, but to include this same genealogy or lists of names with the heads of the families again in Nehemiah chapter 7. So obviously it is important, and there's some benefit for it. Maybe you're expecting a child in the near future. You can look over these wonderful lists of names and pick one of these names out for your children. I saw the name Gibbar. I've never met anybody who named their child Gibbar. So it's free for the taking if you want to name your child Gibbar. I was very impressed with the name Asgad. That sounds very noble, doesn't it? Naming your son Asgad. "Son, clean your room." "I'm Asgad. I don't. That's below my dignity. I looked down and saw the name Nebo. Sounds like a good name for a pet. I mean, they have fish that they name Nemo, so maybe if you had a dog and you were thinking about a name, do not name your dog Chuck. Name your dog Nebo. That would be a great name. Down in verse 15, there's an interesting and odd name there, Aiden. Who would name their child Aiden? I mean, I don't know, but forgive your parents, Aiden. They didn't spell your name correctly. They got your brother right, by the way, Allen, but they didn't get it quite right. But I'm sure there are meanings behind all of these names. And if you were one of these fathers or heads of household, these names would all be important to you. By the way, the names Jeshua, which is a transliteration of Joshua, and Nehemiah and Mordecai are not the Bible characters we normally associate with those names. Of course, Joshua had long been dead. The name Nehemiah cannot be the Nehemiah that carries the name in the book, although he was somewhat contemporary. How do we know that? Because this lists the people who were part of the first returning Jews in the first group coming back to Jerusalem. Nehemiah would lead his own group later on, much later down the road. So it's not that, when you see that name Nehemiah there, it is not, nor is the Mordecai mentioned there, the name of the Bible character we often associate. But anyway, this is really a chapter of names and numbers. If you were having a hard week and you were seeking a passage of Scripture to go to get encouragement or to help you through a difficult time, you probably wouldn't turn to Ezra chapter 2 and read that and say, "Oh, I feel so much better. I feel so uplifted after reading all of these names and all of these numbers of people in there." But again, it is important because God saw it fit to include it in there. So why would God include an entire chapter with all of these heads of families and names? It's significant. Let me give you some reasons why we have this list given to us. Number one, this list basically allowed the families named here to go back to Jerusalem and claim land rights, which was huge. you'll find out later that Cyrus gave a decree with these very people listed, the names of these heads of households in this list. So it allowed the people on this list to go back and say, I am entitled to my land. Although we were in exile for 70 years, we're going to go back and reclaim that which is ours. We all know of stories throughout history, and maybe practically some of you know of stories, people in contemporary regions, who abandoned their land and somebody else took it and gained ownership of their land because they just, for no other reason than they left it. So this book provides them with these land rights. You also learn that this list differentiated the Israelites from the groups that were referred to as Samaritans. And with that tremendously difficult social interaction carried over all the way into the New Testament, because there were people that were carried away in exile to Babylon who intermarried with not only Babylonians but people from other countries, as the Babylonians were known for bringing the best of the people into that region, and they intermixed and intermarried with those, and they were not strictly Jewish by heritage, and this list would exclude those who were not strictly Hebrew, and that would become important down the road. Later in chapter 5, there's a man by the name of Tatnai. We'll look at him in a couple weeks or a few weeks. And he basically contested the right of these people coming back, these tens of thousands of people to come back and resettle the region. And he said, hey, you can't do this. And Ezra basically said, oh yeah? Well, here's a list. Here's the genealogies. We've kept these records, accurate records. And Cyrus gave his stamp of approval for these families specifically to come back and resettle. And you'll find out when we get to chapter 5, that was the end of the argument. In fact, at risk of his own death, Tatnai had to back off of that, his opposition of God's people, because these records were kept meticulously. They factored in greatly in chapter 5 when these families came back to resettle. It's also essentially a genealogical document. You know, some people keep records of their family line, and that's significant, of course, for God's people, the Jews. But a commentator by the name of Derek Kidner kind of summarized why this chapter is important. He said, this chapter, however uninviting it may seem, is a monument to God's care and to Israel's vitality. The thousands of homecomers are not lumped together, but in characteristic biblical fashion relate to those local and family circles which humanize a society and orientate an individual. And for the people's part, their tenacious memory of places and relationships, still strong after 2 generations in exile, showed a fine refusal to be robbed of either their past or their future. We don't relate to this too much in our culture today, but it was huge. It's very significant for them. And he went on to say, Kidner did, that the primary reason for these detailed genealogies was not so much for a social, to relate to each other socially, but it was more religious in nature, which is why we'll see in a moment why this genealogy separates those who are directly involved in the temple worship in the latter verses. They're not included with the other families in the initial. So it's significant and important. So we're going to look at that chapter today. If you're taking notes, I want you to see, first of all, God's faithful pilgrims. This chapter contains a lot of names, some of them hard to pronounce, some of them you've never heard before, and you won't remember them a week after this lesson is over. It also includes some cities and people that came from various towns, and a lot of numbering, a lot of figures given here, and to some of you, that doesn't appeal to you, and you could never remember all of these numbers. But as I read through this chapter, let me give you just a rough sketch breakdown of how this works. In verses 2 through 20, we have various families, and specifically led by the fathers or the heads of those families are listed in verses 2 through 20. Verses 21 through 35, we have all these various towns and their populations mentioned. Verses 36 through 39, we're given the priests. Verses 40 to 42, the temple singers and gatekeepers. Verses 45 to 54, the temple servants. They had a lesser role, but still an important role. Verses 55 through 58 list the sons of Solomon's servants. And then in 59 through 60, a list of those who could not prove which tribe they originated from. And they were kind of outcasts. They couldn't trace their ancestry directly to a tribe, or lost their identity, or in the move and in the decades of captivity, didn't keep records or knowledge of what tribe they were from. That was huge to God's people. In verses 61 through 63, it lists those claiming to be priests, but they also could not prove the origin of their tribe. In fact, it was kind of interesting. I'm just going to skip ahead because I have to cover a lot of material in this chapter. When they claimed to be priests but didn't know exactly what tribe they were from, or couldn't trace their genealogy or their ancestry because somebody didn't do as good a job as this person did in keeping all of these records, they had to conclude whether or not they were allowed to fulfill the role of a priest. And they did something very unusual. They had what's called, on the breastplate of the high priest, they had what's called the Urim and Thummim. And there's been a lot of speculation through history what exactly this was. They were apparently two stones mounted on the breastplate of the high priest, and they would somehow be used, maybe like casting lots, or I don't know exactly how it worked. The Bible never describes and defines how they were used, but God would use this mysterious process to confirm his will. And so they would use these two stones to determine whether or not the people claiming to be priests but could not trace their family back to a specific tribe, they would determine, high priest would determine whether they could fulfill that important role when the temple worship resumed. So it's kind of that's a whole interesting side story to look at. We'll not get into that today, but anyway, that's a breakdown. Now, nobody here, perhaps except David Lyon, looked over these figures and had all these numbers already added up in his head. He probably said, "Hey, Pastor, I just quickly looked over this list, and hey, there's a discrepancy here," because we know from our charts. Where's my chart? You don't have one of these, by the way. There's some extras on the back table in the foyer. On the chart, in the middle section of your chart, there's a row that talks about the first return, restoration, second return, restoration. And the first return lists a figure of 49,897 men. So here's the curious part about this. That is the total given to us in Ezra chapter 2. However, if you add up all of those families and priests and individuals, the figure is far less than the 49,800 whatever men. And so people have tried to speculate as to why the numbers are different there. And, we would just probably read over it and not even think to look at the numbers, or we don't care if there's a discrepancy. We can't explain anyway. But this kind of thing really bothers people like David. They want everything to line up exactly right when they're doing that kind of stuff. So I'm going to do my best in all the research I could get on this subject to give an idea of why the numbers were different between the total given at the end and all the figures in the course of the chapter. One reason they believed, and I believe this is an erroneous view, is they thought, well, that just represents the men. That just the men in these figures here, their head of households, and all the males in the home, but not the women and children. I don't think that's the correct view here, because they list a total in these numbers, if you added them all up, 12,542. And that would be quite a bit less than you would expect if there are 30,000 men, and some of them, many, I would say most of them were married, of those 30,000, then that would already make it, if a good majority of them were married, that would be probably well over 50,000 already. Then you have the children. And a lot of people had in that day a lot of children. I don't think that represents just the males that they counted in this census, this genealogy here. I think it was probably beyond that. So others have argued that it represents men who were living in and around the area of Jerusalem. We will find out in a few weeks that the city itself was pretty much a ghost town. But there were settlements outside the perimeter and the cities around there that represented people who basically heard, hey, our people are coming back to resettle the city. There's a great group being released from Babylon. Some of those people are our friends, or their grandparents were our friends, or some of those people are related to us by blood. And they're all coming back to resettle. We want to get in it. We want to have a part in this. If for no other reason, why would they want to come and converge back in Jerusalem when they heard this great group of exiles? 50,000 were coming back to the region of Jerusalem. for no other reason than what? Think selfishly. Land. If they come back and they're resettling there and they're giving their land, they're dividing up this land back to the people in the area, they said, well, we're entitled to some of that too. So they might have come from the neighboring. First of all, you had a whole northern kingdom. Now, their capital was not located in Jerusalem. There's sort of a civil war between the nation of Israel, and they were situated in the north. And they were overthrown by the Assyrians, not the Babylonians, but they might have said, hey, we could get a good life for us down there in Jerusalem. And they might have come into that region, and they were part of the original 12 tribes, were they not? Their land was divided up among the nation. And there were people in the outskirts of the area that came. So most Bible scholars believe the reason that the figure in all these individual figures added up is quite a bit less than the final total given is because there were people that were not in exile in Babylon who came back, but they were in other surrounding regions, and they converged on that area. In fact, we don't want to jump there ahead of time, but in the early verses of chapter 3, we'll find out how there were times of the year where all of them came, all people, Jewish people from all over, came back and converged together and fellowship together, and in that case, of course, they worshiped together. So that would be the difference between the figures there. It's just worth noting that, you know, there was a degree of faithfulness on the part of these people for whatever motives they had. If they wanted to reclaim their land, they wanted to see their relatives, they wanted a better life, they wanted to come and help and aid Zerubbabel and this group that was coming back. It was. You don't get 50,000 people making a long pilgrimage like that without the news arriving ahead of time that they're coming. They decided to come and be a part of that group, and that's why you have these large numbers in the almost 50,000 people. But I want to see, secondly, God is faithful to his people. So not only were God's faithful pilgrims demonstrating their faithfulness by coming, but God proved his faithfulness to his people. Just as he led the Babylonians to take them away, he has now opened the door for them to come back to their homeland, just as he had promised. Now, there's a fascinating side story in this I want to share with you, if I can, in the time that I have today. You remember I named some of the prophets. I think it's on our chart. Some of the prophets that were involved, not on this chart, sadly, but there's some prophets that were contemporary with Ezra and the people of his day, and they gave prophecies not only during this time, but prior to their captivity. One of them was Isaiah. We looked at Isaiah. Another one was Jeremiah. In fact, Jeremiah wrote more about the events of the captivity in Babylon and their return than any other prophet. So Jeremiah, if you want to turn there to Jeremiah chapter 32, he talked about what was going to happen. And something interesting took place while he was prophesying and preparing God's people for what was going to happen. The Babylonians had besieged the city, and I'm going to paraphrase what Jeremiah might have said. It would have gone something like this. Hey, you know what? I told you this was coming for years. God's directed you to turn from your idolatry and your wickedness and turn back to him. And we need to call out for God for mercy. Maybe he'll stop this eventual captivity that I've been prophesying about for several years. And then when the Babylonians showed up at their doorstep and besieged the city of Jerusalem, he was still inside the city with the king. The king at that time was a man named Zedekiah. Remember Zedekiah? And he was telling Zedekiah, I told you so. Don't you hate it when people tell you, I told you so? I mean, and we should get mad at ourselves. If somebody comes to us and warns us and we foolishly go on and then we're suffering the consequences, and somebody came and said, I told you so, who are we most often mad at? The person who is telling us, I told you so. We should be mad at ourselves. They warned us or tried to warn us. But Zedekiah got angry with Jeremiah. And while the city is besieged by the Babylonians, they're in this destitute condition, he throws them in jail inside the city of Jerusalem. So he's in this jail cell, and he knows what's coming. He's prophesied about it. God revealed to him that this was it. They're going to be carried away captive. And many prophecies were given by God's people through the years of what would happen. Strangers would carry their young men away, and they'd decimate the city. And Zedekiah knows all this is happening. While he's there in jail, he gets a visit from a cousin. He wasn't there to bring him food and encourage him and have a word of prayer with him in his imprisonment. But he came, kind of interesting, he came and said, hey, there's a piece of land that you need to redeem. In other words, you're entitled to it legally because land was everything, passed from generation to generation. You need to redeem this land. You need to buy this back. You're entitled to this land. That's an odd time for your cousin to show up. You're in jail. The Babylonians are surrounded the city. You're going to be decimated and carried away captive. And your cousin shows up and said, hey, Jeremiah, you really should buy up that land. It's been in the family, and you have this opportunity to buy that land. And you could tell by his situation there, that would be an odd thing. I would say, what in the world are you talking to me about land when we're about to be, everything we know about our lives is about to be turned upside down? And the land, by the way, was located in a place called Anathoth. Anathoth is referenced down in verse number 23 of our text chapter. And Jeremiah thought to himself, well, this is an odd request, but he concluded, God gave him the insight to say this. He said, this is the word of the Lord. This is what God wants me to do. And he redeemed that land. And that's where I want to draw your attention. If you're in Jeremiah 32, if you look in verse 14, thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, take these evidences, this evidence of the purchase. We call that a title today. Take this legal document, this legal paperwork, this title, both which is sealed and this evidence which is open, and put them in an earthen vessel. In other words, we're going to have to put this away for a while. If we don't store it correctly, it's going to be destroyed. I won't be able to access this title and prove that that land is mine next month, next year, but at some point, this document's going to become important. And this is where his faith is on full display. That they may continue many days, for thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, houses and fields and vineyards shall be possessed again in this land. He said that when they were days away from being carried away captive. But he said, God, this is the word of the Lord. God is revealing this to me. God sent you to me to encourage me to redeem, to buy that land that I'm entitled to, because God's telling us one day we're going to come back and we're going to be back on our properties. That's over 70 years before the book of Ezra. Kind of exciting to see how God... If we go through difficult times and rough patches in our life, and we are prone to question God. Why are you allowing this to happen to me, God? Why is this all going down in my life right now? And the truth of the matter is, if we knew everything that God was doing in our lives, through our ups and through our downs, through factors we don't understand or can never explain in this lifetime, if we really knew how God was at work in our lives, we'd either be reduced to tears or we would be scared to death. Depending on your faith and your perspective of what's going on. Because here's what we do. We go through life and say, well, that just happened. What a coincidence. Or something good happened. That's good luck. Things are falling my way. We don't understand that every event in our lives is orchestrated by God, and He is often moving behind the scenes, and He's often doing so long before the fact. 70 years before Jeremiah would ever realize the property, God was telling him, it's all going to come back, because I'm in control of all of these things going on in your life. And that ought to build our faith and encourage us. God has truly been faithful to us, has He not? No matter how hard you're having things, God has been faithful to you. There's a verse in Psalm 130 that says this, if thou, Lord, shouldest mark iniquities, in other words, if you were to keep track of my sins and my spiritual failures, if thou shouldest mark iniquities, O Lord, who shall stand? God has not only marked our iniquities, He has put them under the blood of Jesus Christ. He has forgiven them completely. And it's a demonstration of His grace. And we see these evidenced in real life stories like this, where He's going to this prophet 70 years before the fact and saying, go ahead and buy that land, because one day you're going to be going back and you're going to be farming this land again, and you're going to be enjoying the benefits of the land. God is certainly faithful to His people. But I want you to notice finally, God's faithfulness must be reciprocated. When we've been restored into fellowship with God and are enjoying the blessings of His goodness and grace in our lives, there should be a natural response. Nobody should have to tell us this. There should be a natural response on our parts where we said, God has done so much for me. The very least I can do is to be faithful to him. God doesn't say, I'm going to show my grace and goodness to you if you promise to repay it with your faithfulness, because he knows we're frail and sinful. We're weak and uncommitted. But when we come to realize that these moments in time where God has done something in our lives, either it's our salvation or the many other thousands of things he does for us, at some point we got to sit down and assess our lives and say, what, the very least I can do is to honor God with my life because he has been so good to me. One reason why it was important for the individual families to be mentioned here in this chapter is to show them that God had not forsaken them, even though 70 years had gone by. They had still remained in these family groups. And these family ties were very, very important. As recently as a few generations ago, in our lifetime, these family ties were really incredibly important. It was not uncommon, particularly in other parts of the country, for people to be born, to grow up, graduate from high school, marry, work, and die in the same city. Sometimes on the same piece of land. Now, I don't know about if all of you know your heritage or where you come from and so forth, but I know because somebody has gone through the trouble of putting a family tree together from my... And by the way, I'm going to tell you, when I first got those booklets of my family trees on both my mother and father's side, I was like, whoa, I flipped through them. Whoa, that's a lot of names of people. Let me see if I can find... Oh, there I am right there. They spelled my name wrong. Aiden, don't feel bad. They spelled my name wrong, Okay, there I'm there. I close it up, and I put those books away. Do you know where they are today, honey? Do you even know where they are today? Huh? You think, I don't even know where they are. I have not referenced them in decades, It was different in that day. 4 brothers in my family line were living in Germany, and they heard about this new place that they could come to. And there was a lot of fertile farming land. If somebody did some research somehow, or word of mouth came back, and these 4 brothers decided to move to Ohio, of all places, and become farmers. And they did. Their last name, by the way, was Muller. Not Miller, not Mueller, Muller, M-U-L-L-E-R. That was their last name, all brothers. And they came to the area, and back then, it was kind of strange. Some people were more for their occupation than they were their name. And so it's funny how if you do some research on names and how names were given, one of the ways that Americans received last names were by their occupations. You know how there are a lot of Smiths? There's a lot of people named Smith. I think it's one of the more common last names in our country. Well, they were often associated with the craft. So it was Philip the Smith. If you needed, welding, or actually, Philip knows a little bit about welding. If you knew welding or horseshoeing or whatever it is, you go to the Smith, and he had a shop somewhere in town, and you take whatever you need done there, and he'd have a furnace, and he'd spend the hot day fixing people's things and making things and repairing things. He was the Smith, so he would be Philip the Smith. And then eventually they just dropped that "the," and it would just be, what's the guy that lives on the outskirts of town that does horseshoeing? Oh, that's Philip Smith. And then when he had children, they were named Smith because they often took the occupation of their parents. And that's how some of the names got transferred through the years, how the last names were identified. That was not their original last name. Well, in my family's case, they were working hard to assimilate into American culture. They were from Germany. There was probably, I don't know this for a fact, there's probably some animosity towards foreigners coming to the country. There always seems to be a problem with that, foreigners coming to the country. And so to assimilate with the culture of their community, they made a simple little change in the name from Muller to Miller, because there were people who milled the crops that were being farmed in that area, big farming time in the early 1900s in that region. And so they just changed their name. Nobody went to any government office. There was no official application. It was kind of crazy. They just decided just to change their name, and here I am all these years later, and my legal name is M-I-L-L-E-R, when in reality it should be M-U-L-L-E-R, Muller. And these families, in my family heritage, they were farmers. And there was an identification with that. And boys grew up, and they just assumed when they were growing up, they helped out on the farm, did that kind of work, and they assumed one day I'm going to inherit the farm, and I'm going to be a farmer, and so will my children and their children. We're all going to farm forever and ever and ever. That's how they grew up. My father grew up on a farm, my natural father. He grew up on a farm, and he was smarter than the rest of them. He said, this is hard work. I have to get up early in the morning. My dad, working me all day long, and there's not a lot of variety in this job, and you're dependent on the weather conditions, and Ohio wasn't exactly, Palm Springs or, Los Angeles. The weather wasn't great. And he said, enough of this. And he said, I'm out of here. And the way he could get out of that is he joined the Air Force. That sense of adventure. I'm going to go join the Air Force, get out. I don't want to be a farmer for the rest of my life. And so in that, my dad's generation branched out more in what they did. And nowadays there's tremendous freedom with young people to explore different avenues. Not as many are going to choose the profession of their parents. And there are not as many farmers around either, by the way. But to the Jewish mindset, this attachment with their previous generations was huge. We've had things entrusted to us, my wife and I, from that side of the family, the Miller side of the family, their family heirlooms. I have from my I believe it's a great-grandmother, I have a little glass, hand-blown glass bowl. I think they put party favors or something in it. I don't know how they celebrated, but it was traditional in the German culture to have one of these with, somehow they've etched her name on the outside of this little bowl. And it was given to her at her wedding. And that got passed on to my great-grandparents and ultimately to my parents. But my dad died and my uncle got all this stuff. And I'm having lunch with my uncle. And I'm going to have lunch with him one day. And he says, you may want this. This is your great-grandmother's. This is things that they do on their wedding day. And it has the date of, I think the date of it was 1917. It's old. It's an old thing. So I'm taking this, I'm afraid to put it in the coffee, the cup holder, like it might shatter, I'm thinking, and I bring it back, and honey, look at it. This is from my grandmother or great-grandmother or some relative from 1917. Oh, yeah. But that's not her grandmother. That's not her great-grandmother, whoever it is. She was like, yeah, oh yeah, well, put it in the cabinet, whatever. You know what we've done with that in all these years? Absolutely nothing. But it's a connection to my past. I got from my great-grandfather, from my grandfather, I got a Penn fishing reel, deep sea fishing reel. You all know how great a fisher I am, so that was a big catch for me to get a fishing reel. I wouldn't know how to connect it to a fishing rod, but it was in pristine. It's in the box. It has the instruction manual in it and everything. And I said, wow, this is great. This is an attachment to my grandparents, And I thought, wow, we'll have now my son, that would be his great-grandfather. But more than that, Isaac, it'd be his great-great-grandfather's fishing reel. This is cool. This is history. This is our family line. So I told Luke about it. Luke's like, yeah. Sharon's a little different, which is odd because Sharon's not in my bloodline. Sharon's like, oh, that'd be kind of cool, And I said, I want you to take this and keep it away, and one day pass it on to Isaac. It's going to be from his, what is it, great, whatever, some great. I don't know what it is, but I have the German Bible that came from Germany that my grandparents or great-grandparents used, and I passed it on to Luke and Sharon. Again, Luke was less than enthusiastic, but Sharon thought, oh, this is great. This is a German. This goes back to generations. See, everybody has a different perspective of that. I'm afraid when I pass away, maybe before, if I'm in hospice care in my bedroom and I see a Goodwill truck pull up in front of my house, I'll get out of that bed and chase after it because my wife will be hauling off most of my collections away in the Goodwill truck. And she has no attachment to things, no appreciation for history. It was not like that for the Jewish people. Their heritage was everything. I doubt very many of you can give me the first and middle name of your great-grandfather, great-grandmother. I won't embarrass anybody, but I wonder if anybody can even name the first name of your great-grandfather or your great-grandmother without looking at a record somewhere or something or Googling somebody. Do you even know the name? I'm going to ask, how many of you know the first name of your great-grandfather? Oh, you're surprising me. How many of you know the first name of your great-grandmother? Okay, pretty good. How many of you know the middle name of your great-grandfather? Some of you do. I'm much impressed. I don't even know. And I have genealogical records in my house. I don't even know the name of my I think it's Abe. I think it's Abe, is it? Well, my wife would know. She doesn't care about history. I don't think it's Abe or something, but I think Abe and Sarah are the first names of my great-grandparents, but I don't know their middle names. Did you see how these genealogies were so important? It was a demonstration. Every name you have listed in this chapter, which we might look over and say, oh, and men of this, and men of that, the men of this, and numbers, and okay, let's get to chapter 3. It gets exciting again in chapter 3. We might look over something like that, and we don't realize that these are people for whom there was a promise of land and a demonstration of God's divine providence by bringing them back into their home city to regain what they had lost in their captivity. It was huge to the people of God. And it showed to them that they needed to be faithful to Him in everything that they do. Notice that the priests and the temple servants and singers and those who were involved in the building of the temple and the creation of the worship that would be restored were all mentioned separately. They weren't even included in the main body of the fathers and the heads of these households. They were listed separately because the point was this: God wanted them to come back to worship Him. The priority in their return to this land was to worship Him. And in chapter 3, we'll see, and when we continue this series, because we have revival meetings, Brother Jamal is going to be teaching Sunday school. We have revival meetings with Brother Gleiser the week following that. But when we pick up chapter number 3, when they finally got back, it's like, yeah, we're here, we're arriving, 50,000 people coming back into town. Okay, now we're not here to rebuild this city. What are we going to start with? The very first thing that they built, spoiler alert, without looking, somebody guess what it might be. The what? Temple. Okay, what specifically in the temple? The altar. The very first thing that they built. Before the building ever went up, a beam was put up or anything, gold was overlaid on anything, the very first thing they built was the altar. And you're going to find in a few weeks that when the people came back and gathered as a national, what was left of the nation, to come back to the city for this special religious festival, somebody had come in ahead of time and built that altar so that when they arrived into the destruction and burnt pieces of wood and rubble and neglect over 70 years, what they could see is the altar rising above the destruction of the temple. And that was the first thing that they saw. Somebody said, we need to give these people some hope. And we need to remind them why we're coming back here, to worship God.